3 men and 1 woman walked into Halloran's on a Thursday night. The same back table, the same 1 bottle, but they asked for 5 glasses. Rosalind had seen glasses like that before. She understood right away what the 5th one meant, or she thought she did. The man at the head of the table said it quietly. 1 bottle, 5 glasses. The head server almost asked him to repeat it, then didn't. Nobody made that man say anything twice. When the table stepped out into the hallway, Rosalind set down her mop. She took a napkin, a knife, a fork, and 1 white plate. She folded the napkin the way her great-aunt had taught her 18 years before. Then she stepped back and looked. There were 5 settings on that table now. Not 4 people and 1 extra glass, but a place waiting for someone. The man came back in first. He stopped in the middle of the room. He looked at that plate for a long time, long enough that the head server had to turn away. Then he asked, in a voice so low that only the people nearest could hear it, "Who gave you permission to touch this table?" The whole restaurant went silent. 4 people whose full names nobody in that city said out loud, all staring at a cleaning woman in a gray uniform who had just touched something they had been protecting for 4 years. The manager rushed over, apologizing, promising she'd be let go before the night was out. The man simply raised 1 finger. The room went quiet again. Rosalind knew all she had to do was say sorry, clear the plate away, and disappear toward the storage room the way she had disappeared her whole 27 years. But she saw his fingers gripping the edge of that table, and she understood that he wasn't angry because the place meant nothing. He was angry because it meant everything. So she stayed where she was. She looked at the empty chair at the head of the table and said 7 words, very quietly. 7 words that nobody in that room was ready to hear. Because the person who belonged here asked me to. The man didn't get angrier. He didn't shout. He just sat down, slowly, as though his knees had suddenly refused to hold him. Because all night long, not 1 person at that table had spoken Ambrose's name out loud. And because what Rosalind didn't know yet was that the 5th glass had never once been poured for the dead. If you believe the most invisible people often carry the heaviest truths, leave a like on this story. Share it with someone who's ever been judged by the uniform they wear. And subscribe, so you can walk through stories like this one with us. 6 hours before that man walked into Halloran's, Rosalind Fairweather was pushing her utility cart through the front dining area, and not a single person in the restaurant looked up at her. That was exactly how she had arranged things, carefully, the way someone arranges furniture in a small room so they can move through it without bumping into anything. She came in through the back door at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She hung her coat on the 3rd hook from the left, the one no one used because it was loose. She changed into her gray uniform and tied her hair low at the nape of her neck. Then she began making her rounds, just as she did every other afternoon, and hidden inside those rounds were things only she knew. She knew the 4th step on the staircase behind the kitchen creaked, and she always stepped over it. She knew the outlet near the storage room door tended to short out when the weather was damp, so she plugged the vacuum into the one on the other side. She knew table number 9 sat slightly crooked, forcing whoever sat there to reach too far, so every night she nudged it back into place, and every night the busser pushed it out again while setting the tables. She never said anything about it. She simply moved it back. When she reached the row of tables along the wall, she bent down and picked up a small photograph that had fallen underneath one of them. It was an old family picture, probably slipped from someone's wallet during lunch. In the photograph were a man, a woman, and an old dog sitting between them. Rosalind wiped the dust from the glass with her sleeve, studied the tables nearby, then placed it on table number 7, exactly where she believed it had fallen. She didn't hand it to the manager. She didn't fill out a lost property slip. She simply stood it upright, neat and straight, facing the entrance, so that if the owner came back looking for it, they would see it where they had left it behind. It was the habit of someone accustomed to repairing the things no one noticed, and accustomed to no one ever knowing who had repaired them. As she cleaned, her left hand moved more slowly than her right. The 3 middle fingers had curled inward and could no longer straighten, and she held the cloth in a particular way to compensate. New employees sometimes noticed and asked about it. She always answered with the same 3 words, an old accident, then asked them something about their shift, and the conversation moved elsewhere. No one ever asked a second time. People rarely ask twice about something another person clearly doesn't want to explain. One young waitress had once learned that Rosalind had studied nursing for 2 years before leaving school. She asked why. Rosalind said the tuition was too expensive. It was a perfect answer because it was true, only it wasn't the whole truth, and people are usually satisfied with answers that are both true and brief. The rest of the truth lay somewhere else, and Rosalind had learned how to leave it resting there. She was 27 years old. She lived alone. She worked one job, in one place, and she had no one to call when she was sick. She didn't consider that a tragedy. She considered it a life small enough for her to carry by herself, and after everything that had happened, a life small enough to carry was something worth protecting. That evening, when she reached the area near the bar, the busser was folding napkins for the dinner shift and ruining several in a row. Rosalind paused for a moment. Then she set down her cloth, picked up one of the napkins, and folded it into a fan in about 10 seconds, so neatly that the young man had to look up at her. She handed it to him without a word, then returned to her mop. She hadn't learned that fold in any restaurant. She had learned it from the hands of her great-aunt, the woman who had taken her in when she was 7 years old. Her aunt had once worked at an old restaurant in the city, the kind with cloth table linens and handwritten menus, and every evening she sat at the kitchen table, teaching the little girl how to fold napkins until she could do it without looking. Her aunt died when Rosalind was 17. Of everything Rosalind carried with her from that part of her life, the thing that remained most intact was the 10 seconds it took to fold a napkin. At 7:15 that evening, the shift supervisor walked past and stopped beside her. She said a special guest had reserved the table in the farthest corner. She told Rosalind not to go near that table, not to clean around it, not to walk past it, and to leave everything to the head waiter. Rosalind nodded. The supervisor remained there for another second, as though she meant to say something more, then decided against it and continued on. Rosalind went back to mopping the floor in the front dining area and didn't ask who the special guest was. In all 6 weeks she had worked at Halloran's, she had never asked a single question that didn't concern her job. That was why people liked having her there. And it was also why, later that night, when everything began, not one person in the restaurant could remember her name well enough to call out to her. To understand how a cleaning woman in a gray uniform carried a 4-year-old promise into that room, one has to go back to 6 hours before those 4 strangers walked through the door. 6 weeks before that night, Rosalind stood on Halloran's back porch for the first time in her life, and she didn't know what she was looking at. Her first shift had ended just before 1 o'clock in the morning. Both of her hands ached in the familiar way, the kind of pain that came from having just mopped a floor larger than the last one. She stepped onto the porch to cool down, lit a cigarette, and looked across the street, because across the street was the only thing there was to look at that hour. An old storefront stood there. The metal shutter had been pulled all the way down, its lower edge rusted into a long brown line. The window above it was covered with so much dust that it no longer reflected the streetlights, only a dull gray haze. The brass digits of the street number beside the doorframe had been ripped off long ago, leaving only 2 faint, dark silhouettes against the faded brickwork. There was no sign, no name, nothing to show what the place had once been. There was only a small notice taped to one corner of the glass, the paper faded and curling at all 4 corners, and Rosalind had to narrow her eyes to read it. The notice didn't say for rent, it said not for rent. She stood there looking at it for a little longer. She had passed through many cities and seen many empty storefronts, but empty storefronts always wanted someone to come inside. People posted telephone numbers. They lowered the price. They wrote urgent inquiries welcome. But that notice did the opposite. It invited no one. It told the entire street not to ask. The head waiter came out onto the porch to wash his hands at the faucet. When he saw what she was looking at, he followed her gaze, then said the place had been empty for 4 years. Rosalind asked why no one had rented it. He said it wasn't that no one wanted to. People had wanted to, 3 or 4 of them over the years. A laundromat, a pharmacy, a Greek restaurant. The thing was, someone had bought the entire building outright and left it sitting there. They didn't renovate it. They didn't tear it down. They didn't let anyone inside. The taxes were paid in full every year. Someone still came to replace the light bulbs in the upstairs hallway. Every few months, a car stopped in front for 15 minutes and then drove away. He said no one in the neighborhood knew who owned it, and when he finished, he gave a short laugh and added that no one asked, either. Rosalind nodded. She pressed the cigarette against the side of the metal trash can, twisting it until the ember was completely dead, then went inside to get her coat. On the way home, she didn't think about the building even once. During the 6 weeks that followed, she passed it twice every day, and she didn't think about it again. On the night of April 8th, At 2 o'clock in the morning, Rosalind sat in her basement apartment and couldn't sleep. She didn't need her telephone to remind her. She had already been awake before the screen lit up. There are certain days in the year that the body remembers before the mind does, and tomorrow was one of those days. She sat up, switched on the small lamp in the corner of the room, and walked to the low cabinet against the wall. She pulled open the bottom drawer. There weren't many things inside. There was an old drinking glass, the heavy kind with a thick base that inexpensive diners often used, with a small chip near the bottom. And there was a brass key, tarnished with age, tied to a rectangular metal tag. A street number had been engraved into the tag. Rosalind picked up the key and held it in her palm, just as she did every year. She didn't look at the number. She had memorized it long ago, memorized it in the way people remember something they have never dared to search for. For 4 years, once each year, she had done exactly the same thing. She cooked a simple meal with whatever she had in the cupboard, usually noodles and eggs, sometimes nothing more than toast and canned soup. She set 2 plates on the small table beside the kitchen. She placed the old glass at the second setting and poured a little coffee into it, because she had never known whether that person drank alcohol, but coffee she knew for certain. Coffee was what she drank on nights when she couldn't sleep. Then she sat in her own place and ate, facing a chair with no one in it. She didn't say anything during that meal. She simply left the chair there. When she stood to return the glass to its place, she passed the bedroom door, and behind it, resting against the wall, was a travel bag already packed. The bag had been standing there for 22 months. The layer of dust across its top was thick enough to trace a finger through. Rosalind had packed it one afternoon, pulled the zipper closed, set it down in that spot, and had never picked it up again. She looked at it for a while. Then she switched off the light and turned away. At 8:07 that evening, the front door of Halloran's opened, and the restaurant changed before anyone had time to understand why. The man who entered first stopped just inside the doorway and stood there for 3 seconds. He didn't remove his coat, didn't look for a waiter, didn't scan the dining room the way people do when searching for their table. His eyes moved through the room quickly and cleanly, over the emergency exit at the end of the hallway, over the 2 windows facing the parking lot, over the darkness between 2 cars parked outside, and only then returned to the dining room. 3 seconds, no more. Rosalind was mopping the floor 2 rows of tables away, and she recognized the habit before she could stop herself from recognizing it. Some people enter a room to find a place to sit. Some people enter a room to know which way they'll leave. The head waiter abandoned what he was doing at the counter and went all the way to the door. He didn't call for her to greet the guests, didn't tilt his head to signal anyone else. He went himself. Rosalind saw him holding several menus in both hands, and she saw the top 2 trembling slightly. He said something very softly. The man didn't answer. He only inclined his head toward the table in the farthest corner, and the head waiter immediately turned and led him in that direction, even though he had clearly intended to lead him somewhere else. The other 3 came in behind him, and none of them said a word to one another. The group crossed the dining room without making any meaningful sound, and the guests at the surrounding tables naturally lowered their voices, not because anyone had told them to, but in the way a room somehow knows how to adjust when something heavy passes through it. They reached the table in the farthest corner and sat down. 4 people, 1 long table, and no one touched the chair at the head. They didn't avoid it ceremoniously. They simply walked around it as though someone were already sitting there, then took the 4 remaining chairs. Rosalind wrung out the mop in the bucket and pushed her cart to the next row of tables, a little closer, close enough to work without being so close that the shift supervisor would have to look at her. From there, she could see the 4 people more clearly, and what she noticed wasn't their clothing or their faces. She noticed 4 other things. The oldest man at the table held a metal lighter and turned it very slowly between his fingers, 1 rotation after another, steady as a habit carried for many years. He didn't open it. He didn't light anything. There were no cigarettes on the table, and Rosalind suspected there weren't any in his pocket either. The man seated to his right placed his telephone on the tablecloth, glanced at his wristwatch at the exact moment the hands marked 7 o'clock in some other time zone, touched a finger to the screen and stopped, then turned the telephone face down without making a call. He repeated the movement twice within 3 minutes. The only woman at the table placed her purse on the chair beside her, picked it up again, set it on the floor, picked it up once more, and finally held it in her lap. She didn't know where it was supposed to go, and Rosalind understood that it wasn't really about the purse. The youngest man pulled out the chair nearest the door and sat there with his back against the wall, facing the entrance, as though there had never been any other chair available to him at that table and never would be. None of the four opened a menu. Rosalind mopped toward the legs of the neighboring table and bent down, and from that distance she could hear them. One quiet, slightly hoarse voice said it had been 4 years, yet it still felt like yesterday. Another voice replied that tonight, it truly did. The mop in Rosalind's hand stopped halfway through its stroke. She stood completely still, her face lowered toward the floor, and for one very brief second, she was no longer inside that restaurant. Then she drew the mop slowly back toward herself and continued moving it in circles over a floor that was already clean. The shift supervisor passed the end of the row and gave her a look. Rosalind pushed her utility cart back 1 row. At the table in the farthest corner, the head waiter stood waiting, his pad already open, his pen ready in his hand. No one ordered. Then the man seated at the head of the table looked up and said, in a low voice, neither hurried nor slow, that he wanted 1 bottle. The head waiter nodded and wrote it down. Then the man continued, in exactly the same voice, 5 glasses. The man sat down so slowly that the chair barely made a sound, and in the silence he asked her what she had just said. He didn't speak any louder than before. If anything, his voice was even quieter, so quiet that Rosalind had to watch his mouth to be certain he had asked the question. She didn't repeat herself. She had said it once, and she understood that if a sentence like that were spoken a second time, it would become something else. It would become testimony, defiance, something people could seize and twist. She simply stood there with both arms hanging at her sides, exactly 1 step away from the table. The youngest man at the table shot to his feet, his chair toppled backward and struck the wall. And this time, the entire restaurant heard it. He asked her what she thought she was doing. He said people were always the same. They saw a name, heard a story somewhere, then decided they had the right to step inside it and put their hands on it, as though another person's pain were something displayed behind glass that anyone passing by was allowed to touch. He pointed toward the chair at the head of the table and said that place wasn't decoration. He said it wasn't something for her to make a night look beautiful. His voice broke on the final word, and that fracture made everything worse, because it revealed that the anger wasn't standing there alone. Rosalind felt her injured left hand tighten into an incomplete fist, and her shoulders drew inward with a reflex she had spent years trying to unlearn and still hadn't managed to lose. She had heard grief disguised as anger before. She had heard it in a small kitchen, late at night, just after the door had closed, and there was no one else left in the house. She knew exactly what it was and where it came from. And she also knew that understanding it didn't make the words hurt any less. It never had. The woman seated across from him dropped the pen she had been holding. It rolled once across the tablecloth, then fell to the floor with a small sound, and no one bent down to pick it up. It remained there for the rest of the evening. The oldest man at the table reached out, placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder, and said his name only once. Beckett. Nothing more. The young man set the chair upright and sat down, both hands flat on the table, his chest still rising and falling, but he sat down. The things he had said didn't sit down with him. They remained suspended in the air between that table and the woman in the gray uniform standing 1 step away, and everyone in the room could feel them. The man seated to the old man's right spoke next, his voice calmer, almost courteous, and it was that courtesy that made him frightening. He asked who had told her that name. Rosalind looked at him. She said no one had told her tonight. He asked again, more slowly, who had told her before tonight. Rosalind didn't answer that question. The woman beside him softly said his name, Cormac, as a warning, and he fell silent. Through all of it, the man seated at the head of the table didn't say a single word. He didn't look at Rosalind. He didn't look at Beckett. He looked at the white plate set before the empty chair, looked at the fan-folded napkin resting beside it, and he stared so long that the head waiter standing at the end of the row had to reach up and adjust his collar simply to give himself something to do. Then the man stood. He rose while Cormac was still about to continue, and Cormac stopped at once. The man crossed the dining room, walked straight to the front door, opened it, and went outside. The door closed behind him. The 3 people at the table watched him leave, then looked at one another, and none of them understood what had just happened. The oldest man softly called his name once, Gus, but he was already outside and didn't hear. Beckett turned toward the old man with the expression of someone who had been abandoned in the middle of a sentence. and the old man only shook his head very slightly and told him to remain seated. Rosalind still stood in the same place. No one told her to leave. No one told her to stay. The restaurant manager stood in the kitchen doorway with both hands clasped tightly together, and he didn't dare call her back either. 2 minutes passed. During those 2 minutes, no one at that table said a word, and Rosalind could clearly hear the air conditioning overhead, the dishes in the kitchen, and the sound of a car somewhere outside, starting and then going quiet again. Then the front door opened once more. Gus stepped inside, walked straight back to the table, and in his hand was a telephone. He didn't sit down immediately. He placed the telephone face down on the white tablecloth, directly beside the plate Rosalind had just set, then pulled out the chair and sat down. He didn't say a word. Gus placed 2 fingers against the back of the telephone and turned it over. He didn't explain what he was about to do. He unlocked the screen, tapped a folder, then selected an audio file on the first line, and Rosalind watched his hand move without searching, without scrolling up or down, the way someone touches something whose path their fingers already know. Then he switched on the speaker, placed the telephone in the middle of the tablecloth, and drew his hand back. The first sound that came through was the emergency operator, a woman's steady voice reciting the familiar opening question, asking what the emergency was. Then another voice broke in, and that voice changed the temperature of the entire room. It belonged to a young woman, and she was breathing so hard that her first few words ran together and couldn't be clearly understood. She said someone had been struck by a car on the outer stretch of Route 6, near a mile marker she couldn't read. She said he was still breathing, and she said it twice in a row, the second time louder than the first. The operator asked whether she was beside the victim. She said no, she was somewhere else, that she had needed to run there to make the call. The operator asked how far away. She didn't answer that question. She said, "Please hurry." And there was something inside those 2 words, "Please hurry," that no one could hear and ever forget, because it didn't sound like someone reporting an accident. It sounded like someone begging. The operator asked for her name. There was a silence. In that silence, the wind could be heard clearly, along with cars passing somewhere behind her. Then she said she was only passing by. The operator asked again, more slowly, telling her to give her name so they could contact her if necessary. The woman said she had to go back to him. Then came the sound of the receiver striking something metal, and the call ended. The entire recording lasted 96 seconds. There were still 3 occupied tables in the restaurant, and all 3 had fallen silent from the moment the first sentence played. The manager stood motionless in the kitchen doorway. The head waiter looked down at the floor. The oldest man at the table, Emmett, was the first to speak, and he didn't speak to Rosalind. He spoke into the space above the table, in the voice of someone repeating a story he had told so many times that telling it no longer seemed to make him feel anything. He said the call had been made from a public telephone booth at the bus station on Route 6, about 200 yards from where the accident happened. It was a coin-operated telephone that kept no number and left nothing to trace. There were no cameras at the bus station, and the nearest gas station was too far away for its lenses to capture anything. He said the police had obtained the recording, opened a case file, and entered a single line into the report stating that there had been an unidentified female witness who refused to give her name, and then the file had gone still. He said that for 4 years, everything they had possessed of that woman was contained inside those 96 seconds. No name, no face, nothing at all. Only a voice. When he finished, he fell silent, and the entire table fell silent with him. Rosalind didn't move. She remained exactly where she had been, 1 step from the table, both arms hanging at her sides, and she said nothing for 20 seconds. 20 seconds, inside a room that has gone completely silent, is much longer than people imagine. Long enough for the head waiter to look up. Long enough for a guest near the window to set down a cup without daring to let it touch the saucer. Beckett was the first to understand. He didn't say anything. He only turned his head slowly toward Rosalind, and his face changed 3 times within a few seconds, from confusion to suspicion, then into something close to fear. The woman seated across from him, Freddie, raised one hand to cover her mouth and held it there. Cormac sat straighter, his entire body rigid, the hand resting on the table completely still. All 3 of them were waiting for Gus. Everyone thought he would rise. Everyone thought he would ask her a question, or say her name, or do something. Because in all 4 years, no evening had ever come as close as this one. But Gus didn't stand. He didn't turn to look at Rosalind. He reached out, touched the screen, stopped the audio file, and turned the telephone face down on the tablecloth exactly as it had been when he first placed it there. Then he said, in a level voice, neither high nor low, that he had listened to that recording more times than he had managed to sleep in the past 4 years. He said he had listened to it in his car, in his room, through nights when there was nothing else left to hear. He said he had believed he heard that same voice at a train station, in a supermarket, at a ticket counter, and every time it happened, he had stopped, and every time, he had been wrong. Then he lifted his eyes, and for the first time that entire evening, he looked directly into Rosalind's face. He said similar voices didn't prove anything. He said he needed more than that. The manager chose that exact moment to step forward, and perhaps he had been standing in the kitchen doorway for 20 minutes trying to gather enough courage for those 3 steps. He apologized again, apologized on behalf of his employee, said this was the restaurant's fault and not the guests', and said she would be dismissed before the night was over. He guaranteed it. He said the final sentence a little louder than necessary, as though he wanted everyone at the table to understand that someone would pay for what had happened. Gus didn't look at him. He looked at the fan-folded napkin beside the white plate and told the manager, in the same low voice, to settle the checks for the remaining tables and kindly send the guests home early. Then he added that the kitchen could close. The manager opened his mouth to say that 3 tables still hadn't finished their main courses, but then he saw something in Gus's face and said nothing. He turned away. Over the next 10 minutes, the guests at the 3 remaining tables were politely asked to leave and given a discount no one had requested, and they went without questioning it, because there are certain evenings when a person only needs to look around once to understand that it is time to go home. The kitchen door closed. The staff withdrew into the back. The lights over the front half of the dining room were lowered, and suddenly, the table in the farthest corner became the only place still illuminated in the entire restaurant. Rosalind remained standing through all of it, with no one telling her to leave and no one telling her to stay. She watched the final guest walk through the door. Then she reached behind her, untied the knot of her apron, removed it, folded it once across the middle, and placed it over the back of the nearest chair. She did it with perfect calm, and that calm was what made it worth noticing, because Rosalind understood exactly what she had just lost. She had lost the only job she had. She wouldn't have enough money for next month's rent. She would have no one to ask for a letter of recommendation, and she had nothing in her hands to offer in exchange. 6 weeks earlier, she had believed she had found a place quiet enough to stand. Now it was gone, and she had ended it herself, with a white plate and a folded napkin. She considered taking her coat and going home. No one could have stopped her. But she looked toward the table in the farthest corner and saw the 4 of them still seated, no one touching the unopened bottle of wine. And she understood that if she walked through that door tonight, something would remain inside this room forever, and it didn't belong to her. Gus stood. He walked around the head of the table, reached for the back of the chair no one had touched all evening, the chair no one had been permitted to touch for 4 years, and pulled it out. He drew it all the way back, turned it slightly so that it faced her, then stepped aside. Emmett looked up. Cormac looked at Emmett. Freddie lowered one hand beneath the table, very slowly. Beckett opened his mouth, and the other 3 looked at him at once, and he closed it again. No one objected. Rosalind walked forward, stood before the chair for 1 second, then sat down. She sat in the place those 4 people had preserved for 4 years, the place where no one had been allowed to lay a hand on the back of the chair. Before her was the white plate she had set with her own hands, and to its right stood the empty drinking glass. She placed both hands on the tablecloth, her left hand first, and she didn't hide it. Gus sat in the chair opposite her, the full length of the table between them. Then he said his name. He gave it in full, Augustus Thornbury, and Rosalind saw Cormac's brow tighten slightly, because that was something Gus rarely did. In this city, no one needed him to introduce himself, and he had never seen any reason to do so. He said the man to his left was Emmett Barlow, the man to his right was Cormac Vance, the woman was Winifred Cole, though everyone called her Freddie, and the youngest was Beckett Ruane. Then he said the final name. He said his younger brother had been named Ambrose Thornbury. He said Ambrose had died at 26 years old, on the night of April 9th, on a stretch of road off Route 6, exactly 31 miles from where they were sitting. He recited those numbers without the slightest hesitation, the way a person reads something carved into bone. Then he placed both hands on the table, exactly as she had done, and said he didn't care who she was. He said he didn't care what she did for a living, where she had come from, or what she wanted from this table. He said there was only one thing he wanted to know tonight, and he would sit there all night if that was what it took. Rosalind looked down at her hands resting on the white tablecloth. Then she began. Rosalind spoke her first sentence very slowly, and that first sentence wasn't a confession, nor was it a defense. She said he had never told her the name of a single one of them. She said she had searched for 4 years and hadn't found them because what she held in her hands wasn't a collection of names. What she had were 4 people described by 4 details, and she had carried those 4 details everywhere without knowing where they belonged. Then she lifted her eyes and looked toward the older man seated to Gus's left. She said he had told her there was an older man, the oldest of them all, who always carried a lighter but never used it to light anything. Emmett Barlow didn't move. The metal lighter still rested between his fingers, though no one knew when it had stopped turning. Rosalind continued, and this time she no longer described. She returned something. She said he had told her that if she ever found that man, she was to tell him the lighter had been broken for years, broken before he ever began carrying it, and that he didn't keep it to light cigarettes. Emmett lowered his head. His hand closed around the lighter, gripping it so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and he remained that way without speaking. Freddie placed a hand on his arm. Rosalind turned toward the man seated to Gus's right. She said he had told her there was someone who always looked at his watch at 7 o'clock in the evening, no matter where he was or what he was doing, and she didn't know which time zone that 7 o'clock belonged to. She only knew it was 7. Cormac Vance sat motionless. His telephone was still lying face down on the tablecloth, exactly where he had placed it shortly after 8 o'clock. Rosalind said the message for him was not to miss that call, never to miss it, even when he believed there was nothing worth telling that week. She said he had told her the old woman counted every week, and if 1 week was missing, the next couldn't replace it. Cormac said nothing. He raised both hands and covered his face, and his shoulders shook once before becoming still. No one turned to look at him. Rosalind looked toward the woman seated across from Emmett. She said he had told her there was a woman in the group, and that woman kept a folded piece of paper inside her wallet, had kept it for so long that the creases had worn thin. Freddie's head lifted sharply. Rosalind said the message for her was that the paper wasn't meant to be kept. She said he had told her it was meant to be built. In the silence that followed, Freddie remained still for about 5 seconds. Then she placed her purse in her lap, opened it, took out her wallet, and opened that with fingers that didn't entirely obey her. She removed a sheet of paper folded into quarters, yellowed along the edges, with one crease torn and repaired by a strip of clear tape that had darkened with age. She spread it carefully across the white tablecloth, unfolding it one crease at a time. It was a pencil drawing, a storefront viewed from the street, with 2 large display windows, an entrance set slightly to the left, and above it a space for a sign. The letters sketched in faint lines and not yet darkened. In the lower right corner was a small handwritten note and a date. No one at the table looked at the paper. They were all looking at Rosalind. She turned toward the youngest man. Beckett Ruane was still seated in the chair closest to the door, his back against the wall, his face turned toward the entrance, exactly where he had been sitting since the beginning of the evening. Rosalind said he had told her there was a kid, the youngest at the table, and that the kid always chose the chair nearest the door wherever he went, not because he liked sitting there. Beckett looked down at the chair beneath him as though he were seeing it for the first time. Rosalind said the message for him was to stop postponing the wedding. She said he had instructed her to repeat the words exactly, that fear wasn't a good enough reason to make Marisol wait. The name fell onto the table, and no one was able to catch it. Beckett folded forward, bracing both arms on the tablecloth, his forehead lowered against them, and he remained that way. No sound of crying escaped him. Only his back moved. Emmett reached across the table and placed a hand on his shoulder, and this time no words came with it. In that silence, Rosalind spoke the final sentence of this part, and she didn't say it as proof. She said it because it was what she had believed for 4 years. She said she had gone to the library and searched old newspapers, had called a newsroom, had tried to find them with everything she possessed, and in everything she had read, there hadn't been a single line about a broken lighter, a call at 7 o'clock, a piece of paper inside a wallet, or a chair beside the door. She said those things didn't exist in any file. No one had ever written them down. They existed in only one place, and the person who had carried them there had given them to her while he was still able to speak. Throughout those 4 messages, Gus Thornbury didn't say a single word. He remained seated at the far end of the table, both hands still resting on the tablecloth, exactly where he had placed them at the beginning, and he didn't move when Emmett lowered his head, didn't move when Cormac buried his face in his hands, didn't move when Freddie spread the paper across the middle of the table. He watched Rosalind from beginning to end. When she finished her final sentence, he remained still for a little longer, long enough for Beckett to lift his head and wipe his face with the back of his hand. Then Gus asked a question. He asked it in an ordinary voice, the voice of someone asking what time a train departed, whether Ambrose had ever mentioned the watch Gus had given him when he was 18 years old. The question fell onto the table, and no one picked it up. Emmett Barlow's head snapped toward Gus. He opened his mouth, and a word had already reached his lips, but he swallowed it and closed his mouth again. Cormac lowered his hands slowly and sat upright. Freddie looked toward Emmett, then back at Gus, and there was something in her eyes very close to fear. Beckett was the only one who didn't understand, and he looked from one person to another, searching their faces for an answer. Rosalind saw none of that. She saw only Gus. The truth was that Augustus Thornbury had never given his younger brother a watch, not when Ambrose was 18, not in any year at all. The three people seated at that table knew it, and all three understood immediately what had just been placed between them. This wasn't a question. It was an open door, with a trap waiting just inside. If this woman was performing, if she had heard someone retell the story, if she had pieced it together from fragments gathered somewhere else, then this was where she would fall. Because someone who is performing will never allow an empty space to remain. Someone who is performing will say yes. I remember the watch. He mentioned it. He treasured it deeply. People always want to fill the silence another person leaves for them, and that is how lies reveal themselves. Rosalind sat without speaking. She remained silent longer than anyone had prepared themselves to wait. She looked down at her hands, at her scarred left hand resting on the white tablecloth, and she thought, Beckett couldn't bear the silence, and shifted in his chair, and Emmett warned him with a glance to remain still. Then Rosalind looked up and said she didn't remember any watch. She said there had been many things inside those 30 minutes, and she wouldn't dare claim she remembered all of them. But if there had been a watch, she would have remembered it, because she had repeated everything he said that night inside her own mind more times than she could count. She said she was sorry, but there had been no watch. Gus's expression didn't change, but Rosalind continued, and she continued not because she had guessed what he was doing, but because the question had drawn something else up from the bottom of her memory. She said there had been something about when Ambrose was 18. She said he had told her near the end, when he had already begun speaking more slowly. He said that when he was 18, he had wanted to study architecture, and the entire family had opposed it. They had thought it was foolish. Then his older brother had signed the papers guaranteeing his education. He had signed them alone, without telling anyone in the family, and had kept it hidden for a long time. His older brother had paid the first year's tuition with his own money. Rosalind said she didn't know what kind of money that had been, and she hadn't asked. She said Ambrose had told her that story, then fallen silent for a while, and afterward he had added one more sentence. He said that in his entire life, he had never properly thanked Gus for it even once. There was no sound in the restaurant then, except the air conditioning overhead. Emmett Barlow closed his eyes. Freddie raised a hand to cover her mouth for the second time that evening. Cormac Vance looked at Gus, and he looked at him the way someone looks at a wall they know is about to break. Gus Thornbury pushed back his chair and stood. He said nothing. He walked 3 steps away from the table, stopped where the lights had been lowered, and turned his back to them. He stood there with both arms at his sides, his head slightly bowed, and for nearly a minute, no one in the room could see his face. No one called to him. No one rose to follow. Emmett lifted one hand to the level of the table to keep the other 3 seated, though none of them had intended to move. Rosalind remained at her end of the table, both hands resting on the tablecloth, and she thought perhaps she had said something wrong without knowing it. Then Gus turned around. He walked back to his place, pulled out the chair, and sat down. His face looked no different from when he had risen, or almost no different, except that his eyes were redder. He placed both hands on the table again, looked at Rosalind, and spoke 3 words, "Keep telling me." But Gus didn't let her continue immediately. He remained silent for a while after speaking those 3 words, and then he said that before she told him anything else, he needed to ask one question, the only question he had truly wanted to ask from the moment he walked into that restaurant. He said he had carried it for 4 years. He said he had asked the police, the people at the hospital, and the 2 ambulance drivers he managed to find afterward, and none of them had been able to answer, because by the time they arrived, Everything was already over. He said he had asked it inside his own mind every night, and he had answered it with the worst things a person could ever say to himself. Then he looked up at Rosalind and asked whether his younger brother had died alone. Rosalind answered at once. She said no. She spoke the word clearly, with nothing attached to it, and she didn't follow it with any words of comfort, because she understood that the man across from her wouldn't believe anything wrapped in consolation. Gus closed his eyes for 1 second. His shoulders lowered, but his face didn't soften, and Rosalind understood that one word wasn't enough, had never been enough for someone who had waited so long. So she began to tell him. She said she had reached Ambrose before anyone else that night. She said he was lying on his side, and he was still talking. That was the first thing she remembered. Not the scene, not the car, but the fact that he was still speaking when she knelt beside him. She took his hand and never let it go. She had called for an ambulance, and they told her 10 minutes. Then 10 minutes became 15, then 20, then 30. She said that stretch of road was difficult to find, and perhaps they had driven past it and needed to turn back. She didn't know. She said she had studied nursing for 2 years, enough to understand what she was seeing, and enough to know where those 30 minutes were leading. She said she didn't tell him, but he knew. He knew before she did. She told them that he had asked her a question at the beginning, while he could still speak in long sentences. He asked whether she was good at lying. She told him she was terrible at it, and always had been. He gave a very quiet laugh, then said, "Good. Don't start now." At the other side of the table, Beckett made a small sound, half laughter and half something else, and raised a hand to cover his mouth. Emmett nodded very slowly, his eyes lowered toward the table. Rosalind said that after that, Ambrose didn't talk about anything important. She said people often imagine that in such moments, a person will speak of great and solemn things, but he didn't. He talked about the dust inside his shoes. He said he had meant to stop and shake them out all afternoon but had forgotten. He said he owed someone a fish dinner, mentioned it twice, and the second time argued that he didn't owe anything, that the other person owed him. He talked about a card game he had won and still hadn't been paid for, and he said that person was always the same, always finding an excuse. Cormac Vance released a sharp breath through his nose and lifted a hand to rub his eyes. Freddie softly said 3 words, "That's exactly him," and then fell silent. Rosalind said that from time to time, cars passed, and their headlights swept across the trees beside the road, brightening them and fading, brightening them and fading. She said Ambrose watched that light for a long while. Then he said it looked like the lights inside a bakery early in the morning, when someone switches them on while the street outside is still dark and no one has come through the door yet. He said that was his favorite hour. No one at the table spoke. The pencil drawing remained open across the white tablecloth, and now all 4 of them were looking at it. Freddie was the one who broke the silence. In a quiet voice, she asked whether he had been afraid. Rosalind didn't answer immediately. She remained still and considered the question seriously, because she understood that no one asked such a thing in search of a pleasant answer. Then she said yes. She said he had been afraid, and she wouldn't lie about that, especially after he had told her not to begin lying. Then she added that being afraid wasn't the same as giving up. She said that during those 30 minutes, he didn't beg for anything. He didn't ask why it had happened to him. He didn't blame anyone. He only talked without stopping. And sometimes, when she told him to rest for a moment, he would begin again. She said it took her a long time afterward to understand why. He talked because the silence frightened him more than what was coming. As long as there was a voice in that empty space, he was still there, and he didn't want to lie on that road listening to the wind. Rosalind said she answered him not because she had anything remarkable to say. She said she answered because she wouldn't allow the silence to take the final part of his life. She said it had already taken too much from her, and that night she decided it wouldn't take this as well. When Rosalind reached the final part, she had to stop for a moment before she could continue. She said that as time passed, his voice grew quieter, fading so gradually that she didn't realize it was happening until she discovered she had leaned closer without knowing when she had begun. She said that in the end, she had to bend down beside him to hear each word, and he was still talking, still trying to talk. Only now every sentence had to be divided across 2 or 3 breaths. She said she told him to rest, to stop speaking, and he shook his head. Then he asked her a question she didn't understand at all. He asked whether his brother still held Thursday dinners. She said she didn't know who his brother was, didn't know which Thursday dinners he meant, didn't know anything. She asked him what he meant. He didn't explain. He only repeated the same question, more slowly, as though he were afraid she hadn't heard him clearly. At the far end of the table, Emmett Barlow spoke, and his voice was so quiet that he seemed almost to be speaking to himself. He said they had stopped after that night. He said that before then, they had gathered every week, every Thursday evening, at the old woman's house or somewhere else. Whoever was free came. No one forced anyone, and that boy had never missed a single one. He said that after the night of April 9th, no one called the others again. They never discussed it. No one made a decision. The calls simply stopped. For 4 years, they had met only once each year, on this exact date, and tonight was the 4th time. When he finished, he fell silent, and Rosalind understood why that question had remained inside her mind for 4 years, with nowhere to be placed. She said that at the time, she hadn't known how to answer. She said she remembered what Ambrose had told her about lying, and she had considered it very quickly inside her mind, and in the end, she told him that they probably did. She said she didn't consider it a lie. She knew nothing about those people, but she knew one thing, that a man like him couldn't possibly have no one waiting for him. She said he laughed when he heard that. She said the laugh was very faint, almost nothing more than a breath leaving him, but it was laughter. Then his hand gradually loosened around her fingers. He didn't let go. His grip only grew weaker, and she tightened hers to make up for it. Then he spoke 7 words. "Tell them to save me a place." Rosalind stopped there. No one at the table urged her to continue. Beckett Ruane had sat upright at some point, his eyes red, and he stared at the white plate before Rosalind, the plate he had called decoration 4 hours earlier. Cormac Vance remained motionless. Freddie Cole reached out and smoothed the drawing against the tablecloth, a gesture with no purpose except to give her hand something to do. Emmett Barlow looked down at the lighter in his palm. Rosalind continued, and her voice had changed slightly. She said that after that night, she had searched. She searched with everything a person like her could use, which wasn't much. She went to the city library and searched through old newspapers. She read the few brief lines that had been written about an accident on Route 6, and those lines contained his name and nothing else. There was no name for his brother. There was no name for any of them. She called a newsroom, and when they asked who she was, she hung up. She said she couldn't go to the police station and ask, and she didn't explain why. She said she had been carrying 4 people, described by 4 details: a lighter, a call at 7 o'clock, a piece of paper inside a wallet, a chair beside a door, and she had no way to turn those 4 details into 4 names. She said she had carried that message for 4 years with no one to give it to. Then she said the thing she had never told another person. She said that once every year, on this exact date, she cooked something simple at home, set 2 plates on the table, and left 1 place empty. She said she didn't know whether Ambrose drank alcohol, so she poured coffee. She said she sat there and ate alone, facing a chair with no one in it. She said she had done it for 4 years. She said she knew it sounded foolish, but he had told her to ask them to save him a place, and she hadn't been able to find them, so she saved one herself. The restaurant was completely silent. No one spoke. No one moved, and inside that silence, one by one, they understood what they had been looking directly at all evening without seeing. The woman in the gray uniform hadn't stepped into their ritual. She had kept Ambrose's final promise by herself for 4 years, in a kitchen no one knew, for a man whose family name for him she had never even known. Gus Thornbury was the one who broke the silence, and what he said wasn't what anyone at the table had expected. He said she had misunderstood something. Rosalind looked up. He said that all evening, she had believed she had done something wrong, that she had stepped into a ritual that didn't belong to her, that she had set another place without permission. He said she had misunderstood from the beginning, and that misunderstanding wasn't her fault, because there had been no way for her to know. Then he looked toward the chair where she was sitting. He said the place she occupied belonged to Ambrose. He said it had always been Ambrose's place, even back in the years when they gathered at the old woman's house. The only one in the family who dared to sit at the head of the table without anyone objecting, because wherever he sat became the head of the table. For 4 years, no one had touched that chair. No one had needed to tell the others. It was his place, and that was all there was to it. Then Gus looked down at the empty drinking glass to the right of the white plate and said that glass wasn't Ambrose's. He said that for 4 years, once each year, they had ordered 1 additional glass and filled it, and that glass had never been poured for the man they had lost. He said it was poured for the woman in the recording. He spoke the sentence calmly, and that calm made it twice as heavy. He said that for 4 years, there had been one person they couldn't find, one person who knew what had truly happened on that stretch of road, and one person who had remained when none of them had been there. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know whether she was alive or dead, near or far away, whether she remembered or had forgotten. He said the only thing they knew was that she had run 200 yards through the darkness to call for help, then gone back, and had taken nothing for herself, not even a name. He said that the first time they gathered after the funeral, Emmett had been the one to suggest it. Emmett had said that if they were going to leave a place empty for Ambrose, they should also leave one for the person who had stayed with him. From then on, it became their custom. Every year, one glass, filled and set down, and no one drank from it. He said that glass had never been empty. It had only been waiting for someone to come and sit beside it. Then he added that tonight, he had ordered 5 glasses as he had in the 3 years before, and he had never imagined that someone would set a plate for the person they were waiting for. Rosalind remained silent. She looked down at the white plate before her, the plate she had taken from the rack with her own hands, placed on the table with her own hands, and set beside the fan-folded napkin with her own hands. She stared at it for a long time. She remembered walking toward this table while all 4 of them were out in the hallway. She remembered the thought that had moved her hands before her mind could stop them, and now she understood that for the past 4 hours, she had unknowingly set a place for herself. She couldn't speak. Freddie gently pushed the bottle of wine toward Gus. Emmett looked at Rosalind and gave a slight nod, the nod of someone who had waited 4 years for this moment. Then Rosalind did something no one at the table expected. She reached out with both hands, placed them against the rim of the plate, and pushed it away from herself. She moved it slowly, without force, but she pushed it all the way into the center of the tablecloth beside the pencil drawing. Then she withdrew her hands and lowered them into her lap. Everyone at the table froze. Beckett was the first to ask, and his voice was completely different from the one he had used 4 hours earlier. He asked why, then he asked again, almost pleading, why she had done that. Rosalind lifted her eyes toward the man seated at the far end of the table. She said she didn't deserve that place. Gus's expression didn't change, but he sat straighter. He asked why she would say that. Rosalind looked down at her hands, at the left one resting quietly in her lap with its 3 curled fingers, and spoke in a voice so calm that Freddie had to turn away. She said it was because she hadn't finished telling them everything. She said that everything she had told them so far was true, without a single word missing, but it wasn't the whole truth, and the part she hadn't told them was the part that made it impossible for her to sit there. She said she had intended to keep it for the rest of her life. She said she had told herself that returning those 4 messages was enough, that she could give them the beautiful part and keep the rest for herself. And she had believed that for 4 years. Then she said that tonight, sitting in that chair, she understood that she couldn't. She said that if they allowed her to remain there without knowing, it would become the greatest lie of her life, and she had once promised someone that she wouldn't begin lying. At that exact moment, the manager escorted the final 2 guests to the door, and the small bell above it rang once before falling silent. He turned back, stood in the middle of the dining room, looked toward the table in the farthest corner, and didn't know what he was supposed to do next. Gus told him he could go home. The manager said there were still employees in the kitchen. Gus told him to send everyone home. Over the next few minutes, the back door closed 3 times. A car started in the parking lot, and then there was nothing. The lights over the front half of the dining room went completely dark. In all of Halloran's, only 5 people remained, 1 long table, and a pool of yellow light falling across the white tablecloth. Rosalind waited until the final sound had faded. Then she said she hadn't been passing along that road that night. No one understood immediately. Freddie's brow tightened slightly. Cormac leaned a little farther forward. Only Emmett remained still, and Rosalind saw him place the lighter on the table very slowly, like a man who had just heard the first crack of something above his head. She said it again, more clearly. She said she had told the emergency operator that she was only passing by, and that had been the only lie she spoke during the entire night, and she had lived with it for 4 years. The truth was that on the night of April 9th, she had been on Route 6 because someone had brought her there. She said she had been sitting inside a small truck parked along the shoulder, some distance from where it happened, far enough that no one could see her inside the vehicle, and close enough that she could see everything. The headlights were still on. The engine was still running. She said she was sitting there because she had been told to sit there and wait, and there had been many evenings like that in her life. Evenings when her job was to sit inside a vehicle parked somewhere and ask no questions. Beckett asked who had told her. Rosalind didn't answer. She continued, and her voice became more even, the steady voice of someone reading something she had written inside her mind a very long time ago. She said she had seen everything. She said the newspapers had described it as an accident, that the car had lost control on the curve, that the road had been wet. She said she had read those few lines at the city library and had sat in front of that screen for a very long time, because she had been sitting not far away and had seen it, and what she had seen wasn't what they had written. She said there had been 2 cars on that stretch of road that night. No one at the table spoke. Rosalind said the second vehicle had followed behind. It stayed there for a long distance, never passing, never falling back, holding the same distance. Then, just before the curve, it moved against him. She said she wouldn't describe what happened, and she hoped they wouldn't make her describe it. She would only say that the other vehicle had forced Ambrose's car off the road, and afterward, it didn't stop. It didn't slow down. It kept going and disappeared. She said she waited 2 seconds, 3 seconds, expecting its brake lights to appear somewhere ahead, but they never did. The silence inside the restaurant was different then from every silence that had come before it that evening. Rosalind continued more quickly, as though she feared that if she stopped, she wouldn't be able to speak again. She said that for 4 years, she had been the only person who knew. The police didn't know, the newspaper didn't know, the family didn't know, and the 4 people sitting at that table didn't know. She said she had never told anyone, not once, in 4 years. She said she had stood outside a police station one time, on a morning in May, and had remained across the street looking through the entrance for about 20 minutes before walking away. She said she would explain why, but not yet. Emmett Barlow stood. He didn't say anything to anyone. He crossed the darkened dining room, walked to the front door, turned the lock, and tested the handle by pulling it down once. Then he remained there for another second, looking through the glass toward the parking lot, before returning to the table. Cormac Vance rose, went to the windows, and lowered both curtains from left to right without hurrying. Freddie Cole folded the drawing along its original creases and returned it to her wallet. Beckett Ruane didn't leave the chair beside the door, but he turned around, and now he was no longer watching the entrance. He was watching the table. No one touched Rosalind. No one moved closer to her. No one raised their voice, struck the table, or spoke a single threatening word. But within less than 1 minute, those 4 people had done 4 very small things, and after those 4 small things, the room had become a different room. Rosalind understood that. She remained seated at the head of the table, both hands resting in her lap, and she didn't let them see that she was afraid, because she had spent many years inside rooms where showing fear only made everything worse. Gus Thornbury still hadn't moved. He remained in his chair, both hands resting on the tablecloth, and he watched Rosalind with an expression she couldn't read. Then he spoke, his voice even lower than before, and told her to continue. He said he wanted to hear everything. Rosalind lifted both hands from her lap and placed them on the white tablecloth, both of them, open, hiding nothing. Her left hand lay palm up, revealing the quiet marks of her past, and this time all 4 of them saw it. She said that the man driving the second vehicle that night had been her husband. She said his name was Dale Coburn. Beckett Ruane shot out of his chair so quickly that no one had time to react. The chair toppled again, for the second time that evening. He had taken exactly 1.5 steps when Cormac Vance moved in front of him, both hands resting on his shoulders, not pushing, only holding him in place. Cormac didn't say a word. Beckett called his name once, his voice breaking, and Cormac didn't move. Freddie Cole called Gus's name, then called it again, and the second time she nearly shouted. Through everything happening at the other end of the table, Gus Thornbury remained still. He didn't turn his head toward Beckett. He didn't say a single word to Cormac. He stayed in his chair, staring at the 3 curled fingers lying open on the white tablecloth, staring for so long that Emmett Barlow had to look toward him to make certain he could still hear. Rosalind didn't withdraw her hand. She left it there and continued, because she understood that if she stopped now, she would never be able to speak again. She said she wouldn't ask any of them not to be angry. She only wanted to tell them why she had remained silent, not as an excuse, but so they would have everything before they decided what to do. She said that after everything was over that night, she returned to the truck. She said she had nowhere else to return to. She was 23 years old. She had no bank account of her own, no insurance, and no qualifications, because she had left nursing school 2 years earlier. She said she didn't have a single person she could call. Her great-aunt had died when she was 17. Her old friends had disappeared one by one in the way people disappear from the life of a young woman who gets married and stops going anywhere. She said she had considered going to the police. She had stood across the street from the station for 20 minutes on a morning in May, and during those 20 minutes, she had considered every possible path. She said that even if they believed her, even if they took her statement, she would still have to go home afterward. She said she knew exactly what would be waiting for her there if she opened her mouth, and she said that sentence only once, offering no further detail. Then, she looked down at her left hand resting on the tablecloth, and no one at the table needed her to explain anything more. She said those 3 fingers had already been that way before the night of April 9th. She said she hadn't gone to the hospital because she had no insurance, and because people there would have asked questions, and she had no answers she could give them. Freddie had returned to her chair without anyone noticing when. She raised both hands and covered her face. Rosalind continued. She said that 3 weeks after that night, one afternoon, someone knocked on her door. She opened it, and they told her Dale was dead. She said she listened to everything, thanked them, then closed the door. She said she stood in the hallway of her home for a while and felt nothing. No grief, no relief, nothing at all. And that frightened her more than anything else. She said she didn't attend the funeral. She had never visited his grave, not even once. Then she lifted her eyes toward Gus and spoke the thing she had carried for 4 years and had never allowed herself to form into a sentence. She said that when they brought her the news that afternoon, her first thought wasn't about her husband. Her first thought was that there was no one left for her to fear, so now she could search for those people, and she had searched for them for 4 years, and she hadn't found them. When she finished, she remained silent for a moment. Cormac Vance was still standing in front of Beckett, but at some point his hands had fallen to his sides. Beckett Ruane stood there breathing, his eyes red, and he didn't take another step. Rosalind drew both hands back and lowered them into her lap, then spoke the final sentence in the same calm voice she had used all evening. She said she hadn't come there that night to ask anyone for forgiveness. She said she didn't believe this was something that could be forgiven, and she had never forgiven herself. She said she had come there to mop the restaurant floor. That was the only reason she was there. And she had intended to finish her work and go home as she did every other night. Then she looked at the white plate resting in the middle of the table, the plate she had pushed away. She said she had stayed too long. Rosalind remained silent for a long while after that sentence, and when she continued, her voice had changed. She said there was still one more thing. She said this was what she had hidden most carefully. More carefully than the second vehicle. More carefully than the name she had just spoken. And she had promised herself she would carry it to her grave. She said she had hidden it because it was the one thing from that entire night that made it impossible for her to tell herself she had merely been someone who happened to pass by. Then she said he had known. Emmett Barlow's head snapped up. Freddie lowered her hands from her face. Rosalind said Ambrose hadn't recognized her. He had never met her before, and that night he hadn't been able to see her face clearly. He recognized the vehicle. She said the truck had followed him for 15 minutes before that, and during those 15 minutes, he had looked at it in his rearview mirror more times than she could count, long enough to remember its shape, long enough to remember how far apart its 2 headlights were. She said that when she knelt beside him, he looked over her shoulder, past her, toward the shoulder of the road some distance away. The truck was still parked there. The engine was still running. The headlights were still on. Then he asked her a question. He asked whether she had been sitting inside that truck. Rosalind said she hadn't been able to answer immediately. She said there had been only one thought in her mind, that he would pull his hand away from hers, that he would tell her to get out, and that he had every right to do so. Then she nodded. She said she nodded because less than 10 minutes earlier, she had promised him she wouldn't lie, and because by then she had nothing left to protect. She said that after she nodded, she tried to stand. She had begun drawing her hand away from his. She had lifted one knee from the ground, and she intended to go somewhere farther away and wait for the ambulance. Far enough that he wouldn't have to see her anymore. Then she said he tightened his hand around hers. She said that by then he had almost no strength left, and the pressure wasn't strong at all, but it was enough to keep her there. Then he spoke 3 words. Then don't leave. No one at the table said anything. Beckett Ruane slowly sank into the nearest chair. Not the chair beside the door that he had chosen for himself, but the first chair his hand touched. Cormac Vance turned his face away. Freddie Cole let out a sob, then covered it with her hand at once. Rosalind said she stayed. She said she remained until the end. Then she continued, and she told this part more slowly than anything else she had said that night. She said that afterward, near the end, after he had given her the messages for the 4 people whose identities she didn't yet know, he gave her one more message. She said it was the 5th message, and it wasn't meant for any of those 4 people. It was meant for his brother alone. She lifted her eyes toward the far end of the table and looked directly into Gus Thornbury's face, and she said she had carried that message for 4 years and hadn't lived through a single night without thinking about it. Then she spoke it. She said he had told her, "Tell my brother not to look for anyone." There wasn't a sound anywhere inside Halloran's. There was no air conditioner because the last person to leave the kitchen had switched it off. There were no dishes. There were no cars outside because the curtains had been drawn and the door had been locked. Rosalind continued, speaking into the center of that silence. She said she had asked him again. She had told him she didn't understand and asked who he wanted her to tell. She said he only repeated the same sentence. At the time, she had thought he was delirious. She had believed they were meaningless words spoken by someone who was slipping out of consciousness. She said it wasn't until much later, while lying in her basement apartment and turning every word over and over inside her mind, that she understood he hadn't been delirious at all. She said he knew the vehicle belonged to someone. He knew she had been sitting inside it, and he knew exactly who would search for that vehicle after he was gone. She said he had used one of his final breaths trying to stop that from happening. Gus Thornbury stood. He didn't rise quickly or violently. His chair didn't fall and didn't make a sound. He walked around the head of the table, past Cormac, past Beckett, and didn't look at any of them. Emmett called his name once, and Gus didn't turn. He crossed the darkened dining room, went to the front door, and raised a hand to the lock Emmett had secured earlier. He turned it back. The click of the bolt rang clearly through the entire room. Then he pushed the door open just enough to leave a narrow gap, allowing the outside air to drift inside, and stood there with one hand still resting on the handle, his back turned toward the table. Gus stood at the door like that for about half a minute. Then he closed it without locking it and walked back to the table. He didn't sit down. He remained at the far end, one hand resting on the back of his chair, and looked at Rosalind across the full length of the white tablecloth. Then he said it was his turn. He said she had told them everything she carried, including the things no one had forced her to reveal, and if he sat down to share a meal with her, while withholding his own part, he would be no better than a thief. He said that 3 weeks after the night of April 9th, he had taken care of it. He used those exact words and didn't search for any others. Emmett Barlow raised a hand as though he meant to say something, and Gus gave the slightest shake of his head, and Emmett lowered it again. Gus said he hadn't asked the man's name. He said someone had given him an address, the make of a vehicle, and the color of its paint, and he had taken those few things and believed them. He said he hadn't asked why. He hadn't asked who the man was, what he did, or whether anyone was waiting for him at home. He said that at the time, he hadn't wanted to know, because knowing more would have slowed him down, and he couldn't bear to slow down. He said he had told himself he was doing what had to be done, and he believed that for exactly 3 weeks, and after 3 weeks, he stopped believing it. He said that for 4 years, he had lived with 2 questions. He raised one finger and said the first was whether his brother had died alone. He raised a second finger and said the second was whether he had taken the right man. He said he had never dared speak the second question aloud, not even to the 3 people sitting at that table, not even to Emmett, who had been beside him since before Gus was old enough to drive. He said he had locked that question away in one place inside his mind and tried never to pass by it, and he passed by it every night. Then he said that tonight, within the space of about an hour, he had received both answers. He said his brother hadn't died alone. He said he had waited 4 years to hear that, and he had never imagined that when the answer finally came, it would arrive with the other one. He said he had taken the right man. Then he fell silent for a while, and when he continued, his voice broke in the middle of the sentence for the first time that entire evening. He said he had done the very thing his brother had used one of his final breaths to beg him not to do. He said he had always believed that if the day ever came, when he knew for certain he had taken the right man, some part of the weight would lift. He said he had believed that for 4 years. Then he said now he knew for certain, and nothing felt lighter. He said he felt nothing at all. He said there was only emptiness, an emptiness he didn't know how to name. Freddie Cole began to sob aloud and no longer tried to hide it. Cormac Vance turned away and stood facing the wall. Beckett Ruane sat in the unfamiliar chair with both hands holding his head. Then, Gus Thornbury did something those three people had never seen him do with anyone in all the years they had followed him. He walked around the table, came to Rosalind's end, stopped 2 steps from her chair, and apologized to her. He said he was sorry for making her a widow without ever asking who she was. He said he hadn't even known she existed. He said that during those 3 weeks, through everything he had calculated and arranged, he had never stopped for a single second to consider that at the end of that address, there might be someone waiting at home. He said he hadn't thought, and failing to think wasn't an excuse. Rosalind remained silent. She looked down at her hands. Then she raised her eyes and told him not to apologize to her for that. She said it wasn't because she forgave him, and it wasn't because she didn't. She said she hadn't come there that night to demand that anyone pay for anything. She said she had stopped believing in payment long ago because over the past 4 years, she had watched how it worked, and it had never returned anything to anyone. Then she spoke the final sentence very softly. She said she had already paid her share in full. She said she had been paying it for 4 years, a little every day, inside a basement apartment where no one knew she lived. And she said she had paid it alone. Gus didn't return to his seat. He remained there for a while longer, then reached inside his coat and took out a small wooden box, about the length of a hand, tied with a leather cord so worn that the knot had faded to gray. Everyone at the table recognized it immediately. Freddie Cole sat straighter and wiped her face with both palms. Cormac Vance turned away from the wall. Beckett Ruane rose from the unfamiliar chair and returned to his usual place. Emmett Barlow was the one who spoke, and he spoke to Rosalind, not to anyone else. He said the box had accompanied them through 4 dinners. He said it first appeared during the first year, when Gus placed it on the table and then put it away again without explaining anything, and no one at the table asked. By the 2nd year, he had told them, they had promised one another that the box would only be opened when they found the woman from the recording. Emmett said he had believed that promise would follow them all the way to their graves. Gus placed the box on the white tablecloth in front of Rosalind and untied the leather cord. He used both hands, and they trembled so badly that he had to try a 2nd time before the knot came loose. No one helped him. When the cord fell onto the table, he opened the lid. There wasn't much inside, only a layer of fabric lining and a brass key. Gus lifted the key, held it between 2 fingers beneath the yellow light, and said it was the key to the building across the street. Rosalind turned her head toward the curtained windows, and in her mind, she saw the storefront with its metal shutter pulled down, the dust-covered glass, and the faded paper notice taped in the corner. Gus said Ambrose had placed a deposit on the property 3 weeks before that night. He said Ambrose hadn't told anyone in the family, only Freddie, and had made her promise to keep it secret until he finished putting up the sign. He said Ambrose had been traveling along Route 6 on the night of April 9th because he was returning from meeting a building materials supplier. He said that after the funeral, he went to the owner and bought the entire building outright. He hadn't renovated it, hadn't torn anything down, and hadn't allowed anyone to rent it for 4 years. He paid the taxes on time every year. He said he didn't know what he had been preserving it for. He only knew that if someone went inside and sold bread there, or washed clothes there, or did anything else there, he would no longer be able to pass along that street. Rosalind listened to everything, and while he spoke, her hand had already reached into the pocket of the apron she had removed earlier that evening and left hanging over the chair beside her. She took something out and placed it on the white tablecloth. It was a tarnished brass key tied to a rectangular metal tag engraved with a street number. She said she had found it on the road that night. It had been lying about 2 steps away from him, and she picked it up without thinking, simply because it was there and because she needed something for her hands to do. She said she had kept it for 4 years. She had memorized the number on the tag long ago, memorized it the way someone remembers an address they have never dared to visit. She said she had never known what the key opened. Gus placed the key in his hand beside hers. The 2 keys lay next to each other on the white cloth, the same size, with the same pattern of teeth, different only because one carried a metal tag and the other didn't, the same door. No one spoke for a very long time. Then Beckett Ruane stood. He walked around the table, stopped in front of Rosalind, and apologized to her. He said that when he saw her standing beside the table earlier that evening, he saw the gray uniform and decided that was the whole of her story. He said he had made that decision in about 2 seconds and had spoken words he would remember for the rest of his life. Rosalind said he had been protecting Ambrose. Beckett shook his head and said no. He had been protecting the belief that only people like him had the right to grieve for Ambrose. Gus opened the bottle of wine. He poured 4 servings and handed a glass to each person, then poured the 5th glass last. He didn't pour it for the empty chair because the chair was no longer empty. He pushed it toward Rosalind. Then he raised his own glass and spoke his brother's name once, Ambrose Thornbury, and the other 4 raised theirs with him. Then he looked at Rosalind and asked her to finish it for him. She remained silent for several seconds, then lifted her glass. She said he had been afraid. She said he had been brave. She said he had spent the final 30 minutes of his life worrying about the people he loved, one by one, without forgetting any of them. Then she said he hadn't been alone that night, and he wasn't alone tonight either. 5 glasses touched above the white plate she had set with her own hands. 3 days after that night, Freddie Cole appeared outside Rosalind's basement apartment with a locksmith and offered no explanation. She only said the old lock was the kind people bought at a grocery store, and she couldn't sleep when she thought about it. The locksmith worked for 40 minutes, replacing the lock on the front door, installing an additional security bolt, and even changing the hallway light bulb that had been burned out since the previous winter. Freddie gave Rosalind 2 keys and kept a 3rd. She said that if Rosalind ever found herself unable to open the door at midnight, she was to call her, no matter the hour. Then she left, and during that entire visit, the 2 women exchanged no more than 15 sentences. Cormac Vance stopped by whenever he passed through the city, usually in the afternoon, usually before Rosalind began her shift. He sat at the counter, drank coffee, told her a few stories about the harbor, and before leaving, he always asked whether she needed anything. She always said no, and he always nodded as though that were a perfectly reasonable answer. Once, he came with his mother, a small, elderly woman with a very loud voice, and she held Rosalind's hand for a long time without anyone explaining to her why. Emmett Barlow called once every month. He wasn't skilled at speaking on the telephone. Some calls lasted only 3 minutes, and during those 3 minutes, he asked what the weather was like where she was, then asked whether her hand hurt when the weather changed. Rosalind always said it was getting better. He always said good. Then he hung up. But he called every month, and after a few months, Rosalind began to realize that she waited for those calls. In the autumn of that year, Beckett, Ruane, and Marisol were married. The reception was held in a hall with a wooden floor and rows of string lights hanging from the ceiling, and throughout the evening, several children ran laughing around the dance floor. Every half circle or so, one of them would fall, get back up, and begin running again. Marisol laughed until tears filled her eyes when one of them crashed into the skirt of her dress and clung to it, refusing to let go. Rosalind sat in the front row, the row reserved for family. She asked Beckett twice whether it was appropriate for her to sit there, and both times he told her not to ask again. During his speech, Beckett mentioned the cousin who hadn't lived long enough to attend. Then he mentioned a Thursday evening at a restaurant in the city, and he offered no details, and no one in the room needed him to. Gus Thornbury never asked Rosalind whether she wanted a different job. He didn't offer her money, didn't offer her employment somewhere else, and didn't do any of the things a man like him would normally do when he wanted to repay a debt. One afternoon in June, he sat across from her in a coffee shop and asked whether she still wanted to complete the final 2 years of nursing school. He asked only that question and added nothing else. It took Rosalind 3 weeks to answer. During those 3 weeks, she went to work, returned home, lay staring at the ceiling of her basement apartment, and realized that what prevented her from answering wasn't money or time. It was that for 7 years, she had believed the woman who once sat in those lecture halls was dead, and now someone had asked her what would happen if that woman wasn't dead after all. In the 4th week, she called him and said yes. That same summer, Rosalind opened the travel bag behind her bedroom door. It had stood there for 22 months, then 34. She pulled back the zipper and sat on the floor looking inside. The bag held only old clothes, a pair of shoes, and a scarf. There was nothing else. Nothing worth preserving, untouched for nearly 3 years. She donated everything to a charity shop at the end of the street, folded the bag, and placed it on top of the wardrobe. Then the following spring came. The building across the street opened on a morning near the end of March. The sign was made exactly according to the drawing in Freddie's wallet, with the precise spacing between the letters and the exact slant of the pencil strokes, and the sign maker had to redo it twice because Freddie refused to approve it. 4 years of dust were washed from the windows. The faded paper notice in the corner was removed, and Gus kept it. Inside, in the center of the shop, stood a long table with 5 chairs. 4 were for regular customers, available to whoever arrived first. The 5th wasn't. The staff were instructed to leave that chair empty unless someone entered alone, and then they were to invite that person to sit there. During the first year, an elderly man occupied that chair every Tuesday morning. A young woman who had just moved to the city sat there through an entire rainy afternoon, and a man who had recently lost his wife ate there for 3 weeks without speaking to anyone. In the 4th week, he began to talk. Customers often asked why the chair was there. Rosalind, who had left behind the gray uniform and had returned for her first year of nursing school, worked the morning shift at the shop before going to class, and she always gave the same answer. She smiled and said that someone had once taught her that no one should have to eat alone. She explained nothing more, and people didn't ask again. If this story leaves anything behind, perhaps it is only a few small things like these. Kindness doesn't need anyone's permission, and no one should have to prove they are worthy before they are allowed to feel compassion for another human being. People often judge themselves more harshly than everyone around them combined, and that self-imposed sentence is the longest one of all because no one comes knocking at the door to say it has expired. No one should have to carry the guilt of someone they once shared a life with, no matter how the world chooses to look at them. And sometimes, what a person needs most isn't forgiveness, an explanation, or an apology. Sometimes all they need is to know that somewhere, someone is keeping a chair ready for them. If tonight's story touched your heart even a little, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with anyone you believe may need to hear it, so that each day we can gather again and listen to more warm and meaningful stories together. How do you feel about Rosalind's story and that 5th chair? And in your own life, have you ever been the person who saved a place for someone, or the person for whom a place was saved? Please leave a few words in the comments below, because we sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May everyone watching this video be blessed with abundant health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.